All right, how's everybody doing? Well, welcome back to part 4 of modern learning. So, in part 3, we talked about how the brain interacts with data, whether it's in person, and we focused on how it interacts online. And today, I'm going to be explaining how that happens as a whole, as a country. How are we interacting with data now? So, it's important that we break this down into 3 key pieces. So, first, look at the old, okay? So how were we interacting with data in terms of the old era? And by old era, I obviously mean 2010s. Well, matter of fact, it'd actually be, okay? So before the 2010s, all right? And so before the 2010s, we were interacting. It was more so you would be local. So you would be interacting more with your community, your neighbor, things like that, wherever that might be. And as well, you could think about it like your neighborhood, your school, work. And it's important also that we would get our data and everything that we would see from newspapers and TV. TV, news. Okay? And these cycles would be generally slower. There wouldn't be any Twitter bombshell alerts, or there wouldn't be any flash updates across social media. It would be none of that. It would just, you get your information from the nightly news or from the newspapers, and that made it extremely slow. So we can add slow. And that is essentially the old way of how we did a lot of things, socially, our social economic status, it would be mostly considered local, depending on where you were. You wouldn't be competing with everyone around the world at any given time. So now we move into new, okay? So now we are dominated by algorithms, and algorithms are what we live inside of. And that is how we are interacting now with our screens, with our screens and more of our screens. So that's kind of the key thing that's being replacing local and TV is essentially algorithms, your news algorithms, your social algorithms. It's all becoming one. And you've got your feeds, right? You have notifications, all right? You have recommendations. Let me move this out of the way. Rex. So all of that type of stuff, AI content, personalized news, and that is essentially becoming the new old, and it's replacing it. Okay? So it's important to note that algorithms, feeds, notifications, your recommendations, all of that is replacing the older model, how we used to interact. We used to be heavily involved in local communities, local news, local, your school, your work, whatever. Now it's your algorithm. So what you're seeing on your feed is now social. You might have a friend that lives hours and hours away. You never even see them, but you interact with them all the time online. So that's essentially where we're headed. So what I want to explain, right, is the effects of this. Okay? The effects. And before I dive deeply into the effects, okay, we can actually clarify one thing. And just to make sure, got it pulled up. Okay. So the average American, right? Average American spends 7 hours on their screen in 2026. 7 hours of screen time. And that is a lot. And Gen Z is 9 hours. Okay? So over a third of your day is being spent looking online, scrolling, interacting, scrolling. interacting, scrolling. And the problem with this, before we break it down even further, is that for one, if you're scrolling all of the time and you're on your screen all the time on your phone or whatever, and you're on these apps and you notice that you can do this for free, right? So how is it possible that you're able to sit there, scroll 9 hours on your phone for free? Well, there's a simple explanation to that, and it is because you're the product and your attention is the product. So with this being said, right? So we now know the effects of this is going to be you're a lot more easily distracted. All right? You are more tired. All right? You are more likely to compare yourself. And you're more likely to isolate yourself. Okay? So these are a lot of negative things that are stemming from this new generation of algorithms that are being prompted out. And I think we touched on this in either one or two, how most of the algorithms are driving you towards, negative emotions and negative emotional spaces. And that is actually a direct result of the new institution of algorithms. And people don't understand this, but that's ultimately where we are right now. And the screen essentially is becoming the environment that we as a society operate off of. 9 hours of screen time average a day is really damning, because when you're talking about where you're existing and what you're existing in, you're not in the real world, you are now in an algorithm. And that algorithm exists online. And the user you're not just the audience, you're the sensor, okay? So let me pull up what I mean by this, okay? So screens, okay? That is where we operate off of, right? Especially in the 2010s and beyond, we now have the rise of the screens, Internet of Things, yada, yada, yada. That leads us to being able to be on our screens damn near a third of the day. A lot of people are even more than a third of the day. And, that is a problem, because what it's doing is harnessing your attention. Okay? So you being on your screen excessive amounts of time allows the algorithms to harness your attention. Because the more you're online, the more you're interacting online, today's day and age, the more likely it is you're going to be met with a polarizing topic, or a topic that, might make you feel a type of way, for the sole purpose of it gathering your attention. That is it. And so from the attention that it gathers, that actually creates data, right? And let me explain this, okay? So say there's something in the news, right? A polarizing news event that's happening, and you feel a certain type of way about it, and it starts getting flushed onto your feed over and over again, and you see it, you get upset, and you interact, and then it's like, oh, I can't stand this, but you still see it pop up over and over on your feed. Why is that? Well, you've now become a data point, okay? And your online identity, your online persona, personnel, whatever, your beliefs online, whatever you interact with, gets stored as one conglomerate. And what is happening is we're using algorithms, AI, to train that, and to be able to group you in with other groups of, now we know what triggers this person. We know what triggers this person, and we know what makes them mad, so we're able to harness their attention into data, So that's important to understand. And what type of data are they looking for? Well, they want to look for data that shows action off of your attention. And we talked about this last class. I don't know what we might have, but I'll reiterate it. The strongest emotion strongest emotion is anger. Okay? It is actually one of the most primal emotions that we have, and it happens to be one of the most powerful, because when you get angry at something, you're more likely to act on it. You understand where I'm coming from? And an example, right? Say you're a stand-up guy, you have a lot of good morals, things like that, and then you maybe see a child getting abused or attacked somewhere, you know? And your first instinct might be, that is so unfair, you know, it makes you angry. I'm gonna go intervene, I'm gonna go interact with that, get in there, make something happen, you know, so I can protect that kid. And that is anger sparking you to create an action, okay? So with anger comes action, all right? And that has been known throughout the history of time. You know, a lot of revolutions, a lot of wars, you know, necessarily been fought for people that get angry, you know, and once they get angry, you're ready to go pick up the pitchforks and you're ready to pick up the weapons or whatever, and you're ready to go. Why? Because anger is the strongest emotion when it comes to action. That is why we see the rise of the 7-hour screen time, the 9 hours screen time, with the rise of distracted, tired, comparison isolated, these negative emotions, because they're playing off of the strongest one, which is ultimately anger. And that is something that we should understand and be ready to accept and deal with. So screens, attention, data, right? They want data on what makes you angry, what makes you most likely to act, so that they can capitalize off of this. So we can go further, right? So they have the screens, they have that. So now that they have the data, okay, they are now able to predict. Predict, all right? Because online, no matter what happens online, you will still be human, right? And you will still obviously have your certain set of beliefs. You'll obviously have your certain set of identities, but not necessarily are they unique to you, in terms of, more often than not, we as human beings will group together and form our identities based off of, you know, external facts, external validations. So an example of this would be, maybe you are hanging around a bunch of your friends and they all love to play basketball. So the likelihood of you playing basketball shoots up just because that's who you're around, you know? And so the more you're around those people, the more likely you are to be inclined to play basketball. So that is the same thing online. And you can see it online even more clearly, where you can join a group or you join an online social club or whatever, and oftentimes you guys are going to be engaging in the same type of material that you guys considered a shared common interest. And so that is what will lead to prediction, because once they have your attention, right, they're able to get data on you for how you interact, from how you interact with your attention, and they're able to predict how you interact next. So you have the polarizing news cycle that grabs your attention and you interact with it angrily. Now they have data on that. So now they will be able to predict the next interaction or the next negative news feed that will gather your attention to cause you to interact more. And this being the case nowadays is very problematic, because at our core as humans, right, we really just want to find a community. We want to find a community where we can exist within each other, and we don't want to have to live in anger and fear all the time. But with the rise of algorithms, you know, playing specifically on your attention in order to get you to click or to get you to type a response or whatever, it's going to only lead to more to more of this same cycle that is ultimately harnessing negative energy. Okay? So let's move on to. All right. And it's really important that we understand, how interacting online is essentially nowhere near interacting in person, okay? And it's like that because at its core, an online interaction is the same as a peer-to-peer regular in-person interaction in terms of how it's firing upon your brain, how you view the reward system, things like that. But fundamentally, you're just interacting with a set of pixels, a set of ones and zeros that have been stored somewhere and displayed on your feed in order to grab your attention. That is it. And it's definitely something now. Okay? And the feed follows people, it follows them everywhere they go. And that's why it becomes so addictive. Okay? That's why these algorithms become so. You can actually erase this. So just to clarify one more time, the screens grab your attention, right? With that attention, you interact. That creates your data of what gets your attention and what allows you to interact. And then that way they're able to predict that way they're able to predict your behavior and how you'll move and how you'll interact and other social cases. So that is that. Okay? So now, with algorithms, they're addictive. And we've just seen, Mark Zuckerberg in a case with Meta, pretty much explaining or losing the case by displaying how addictive it is, especially towards younger impressionable girls that maybe see somebody online that looks extremely more attractive than they let on, and therefore they feel insecure about themselves. Remember, this is the effect of the new system, right? We're not getting distracted, we're getting tired, we're comparing each other, we're isolating ourselves. All of that, right, creates that addictive frame. And if you really think about it, and you can go a level deeper, you're always necessarily one scroll away, you think, And it'll follow you everywhere. It'll follow you to whenever you're nervous. What do people do whenever they get nervous or they're about to walk past a crowd? They'll see somebody and they'll, let me get down on my phone. You know what I mean? It's that impulsive, anxious attachment to this sort of system because it is trained off of what gathers your attention and what can make you addicted to it, right? So somebody with severe, say it's like body dysmorphia or an eating disorder or something like that, their algorithm is going to be tailored towards them comparing themselves. And that's probably what they're going to end up seeing. And even though it's not the best and it's not healthy for them, algorithms don't care. They only care about what gathers your attention and what doesn't. And what does gather your attention will be pushed to the forefront always. And that creates that addictive loop. And it's always that same thing, just one more video, one more scroll, one more notification, one more check of Instagram or whatever, and it's bad, And then when the phone turns sleep almost into negotiation. Because most of the time, especially in Gen Z, people are falling asleep right next to their phones. They're falling asleep checking Snapchats, checking Instagram, or whatever they're trying to use. And it leads to that negative thinking, you know? And once the sleep breaks down, then everything gets worse, you know? Memory, emotional learning, patience, impulse control, all of that declines, right? And we can harp harder on the comparison aspect because Americans have always compared each other to other people, especially in the old days, right? Like this wasn't new. And locally, you would be comparing yourself to, other people that are local in your immediate vicinity, okay? So this would be like work, school. Really those two places are the most dominant places where you would be comparing yourself to other people. But even then, might just be a handful, a group of people in your small town, in your school, in your workplace, wherever. So you wouldn't be necessarily so out of touch in terms of comparison and comparing to one another because, hey, you can actually see who you're comparing yourself to. And, it's not as damning and it's not as wide of a gap. But, with the rise of Internet of Things, rise of data and algorithms, we see this comparison, right? We can see this comparison. It gets 10 times, and not even 10 times, I'd say 100 times, right? Just because for the simple fact that we're now able to compare everybody in the country and everybody in the world. So you're talking about hundreds of millions of people that are now online and that are able to upload whatever their achievements are at any given time. It's going to spark that increase in comparison, And the brutal part, right, is everything is counted, okay? So this is actually something that's even more damning towards comparing people online versus locally, right? So say if you're at work, right? Say we're in the old days, 2005 or whatever, and we're local, and you're at a work event, and you might see a guy, and you think, oh, hey, this guy's a bit taller than me. He looks a little bit more handsome than me. Well, whatever, you're not gonna see necessarily how many followers he has. You're not gonna see how many friends he has. There's no thing that's above his head that says, hey, this is my follower count. You don't see that. All you just see is a person yourself. So you can have that comparison, but it wouldn't necessarily go as deep as it would go today. And as we see today with the algorithms spark addiction, especially with comparison, what do you see, right? It's easy. You see how many likes this person is getting, right? You see how many followers this person is getting, right? See how many comments, views, etc. Okay? And this leads to a giant leap of comparison because it's like you might see somebody's online profile now. Say it's the same two people, right? Me, the short, ugly guy, versus the tall, handsome guy, or whatever. I'm looking online and I'm seeing his follower count is at like 200,000 or something crazy like that. My follower account is only at 1,000. I'm like, what the heck is wrong with me? How does he have this many followers and I don't? And that is where the comparison really explodes. And it's not something that we can just, ignore or write off because it's so prevalent in today's day and age, especially with how we interact. Because before you accept the follow request, before you about to follow somebody, more often than not, you're going to check these things, your likes, your followers, your comments, your views, like it means anything. When in reality, it means quite literally nothing. And that is something important. Give me 1 second. Okay, so with comparison fleshed out, right? So the effects of this new generation of algorithms, especially online, you see the rise of screen time, 7 hours among the average American, 9 hours for Gen Z. right? We have a horde of negative effects exploding. One of the main ones being comparison, where I think it 100 times between the modern day versus the past. So now you can see people's likes, their follower counts, their comments, their views, all of that thing. And what that does is it brings your identity to a point where you're only existing online. Online. Your identification is online, right? But that's not really the case. And a huge example of this is, the person that is comparing to another person online, not necessarily even knowing the entire story of that person. So they could just see somebody that is, oh, they're driving nice cars all day, every day, and they're going on vacation all the time, but you in particular are comparing yourself, like, why don't I have this car? Why don't I go on this vacation? Not understanding that that person might be thousands of dollars in debt, credit card wise. Maybe they might have an abusive relationship. Maybe they might have negative relationships in their life. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, what social media makes out to be. And that's a huge problem in today. And comparison is a huge problem that rises with these algorithms. So let me erase some of this, right? We already understand. And we can actually kind of move on, right, into the next one, which is isolate. Okay, so how are you being isolated online? Well, you got to think about it, right? Because not only are we seeing these changes in society, we're seeing these changes in daily life, okay? So, yeah, we are connected by data. But we are alone in daily life, okay? In daily life. Because just us being connected does not mean we are connected, okay? And hear me out. Because what a lot of people don't understand is this is one of the biggest contradictions of modern American life. Our digital connection increases, but our physical presence does not increase with it, okay? And that goes back to the old weekly school, the work school, local environments where you would meet people and you would interact with people. You would show up to work and you guys would talk about work. You show up to school and you talk about school, and it would be a lot of that, where that would be the main places where we come together and interact with each other. Now, you don't really have that anymore. A lot of people show up to work, they don't even really want to be there. They don't really have necessarily deep connections with their coworkers. There's no, let's go grab a beer after work. There's none of that. A lot of the places you see now that people will try and meet each other are, like, I guess, the club. You see a rise of the gym. But even in the club and in the gym, more often than not, what are you going to see if you look around for more than 20 seconds? You're going to see people locked in on their phone like there's no tomorrow. So it's like we're connected online by data, but we're so alone in our daily life. And that's a huge problem. It really is, because there's no more interconnectedness in society. It's only just us being dominated by algorithms that we choose to exist in. And that is ultimately the reality that we live in, unfortunately. And as we move on, okay, to the next topic. So just to recap, okay, we have our average American 7 hours, Gen Z 9 hours. We are dominated by existing algorithms that we choose to live in, right? They will choose us what data fits our attention. When we choose to interact with it, then guess what? That gets pushed on us even more. And now it's able to predict exactly what type of information, what type of data will grab you and hold your attention. And oftentimes it's going to be one of these negative effects, just for the simple fact of, as a human being, these are our strongest emotions. These are the strongest emotions that drive action. Okay, so now we can erase this one. So now we can erase this and talk about the next one. And this goes from up top, right? So up top, we have the news. Okay, the news and TV. Okay, and this is a clear contrast from old and new. All right, because nowadays, and especially in Gen Z, how many Gen Z are watching the news, right? None, pretty much. Like, no Gen Z person is watching the news. Where are they getting their news from? Wouldn't that be a surprise? They're getting the news from the algorithms, online, social media, and they don't. Americans don't just read the news anymore. They receive feeds. Okay, so some person with one identity is going to get a news article completely different than a person without that identity, or with a separate set of identities. Okay, so it could be the same news, right? The same news, but guess what? They get different feeds. So same news, diff feeds. Okay? Same news, different feeds. And this is a stark comparison to where we were back in the old school, prior 2010s. Because most people back then would get their news from the TV, from the newspaper, to where, okay, now I can understand what news is being given to me, and it's going to be the same news that a buddy of mine is getting next door. Now, we're so pie in the sky that this guy and this guy, despite them having different identities and being, brought up different ways, will receive information completely different than how it would have been before. So where does that lead us to again when you have these fractured opinions upon people of the same news article? It leads us back to where we started with, guess what? We're now distracted, tired, comparing, and more now we're isolated, just for the simple fact of we can't even get the same information. And the news is no longer reported, it's recommended, There's no more reporting, it's only recommended. And that recommendation, depending on your personality or your set of views, won't even be recommended to you at all. Remember how I said anger, these negative emotions are the only things that are really driving algorithms gaining your attention. Well, that also is applied to the news, because that's where you're getting your info from, the algorithm. So if your algorithm knows that you are a type of person that is extremely into, say you're extremely into hunting or something like that, well, guess what news it's going to probably push you? Say there's a law that bans hunters in a county that you don't even know of. Guess where that's going to show up? It's going to show up on your feed and in your algorithm, But say a guy that is that hates hunting, it'll show up on his algorithm as something completely different. And there's the fraction in real time. You see this with almost every news cycle. There's going to be some random, pie in the sky facts that get thrown out there for the simple fact of holding your attention, holding your anger for you to interact. And then you interact with it, and the more people interact with it, guess what? They're collecting data on what makes people jump, what makes them get up and what makes them interact online. It's all anger, distraction, tired, comparing and isolating. So that's what's going to be promoted and pushed. They will never push and promote cohesiveness and togetherness as a culture, because that does not hold attention and that does not spark you to comment. It doesn't spark you to share. It doesn't spark any of that. Because, like we said, what's the most strongest, powerful emotion? Anger. All right? And so let me wrap this up a little bit. Okay? All right. So the central problem in modern American life is we have more information than any generation before us, but more information has, what the fuck? More information has not automatically made people more present, more rested, more connected, more wise, or more free, because the issue is not just access to information. The issue is the environment, right, that information creates, okay? And online data did not just change what Americans know, but it changed what American life feels like. That's why a lot of Americans that especially exist and subscribe to 7 hours, 9 hours a day, they feel so out of touch and everything feels weird and bad to them, because they fundamentally exist inside of their negative algorithm. They don't exist in the real world where things operate. And that's unfortunately where we're at now. So one takeaway from this, understand that you're existing inside of your algorithm. All of these negative news feeds, negative posts that get thrown at you are only to generate a response from you, okay? That's all that this is trying to do. At the end of the day, when you look at your screen, you're just seeing ones and zeros and pixels. That's ultimately it. And unless you can have a conversation with somebody face to face, then you shouldn't take any opinion from them anywhere, especially online, especially in one of these algorithm dominated apps. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video of Modern Learning Part 4. I will catch you guys in the next one.